The rain fell in sheets across the jungle of Guadalcanal, turning the earth into a miserable soup of mud and rotting vegetation. Marine Corporal Silas Hartwell lay motionless on the ridge, his body pressed flat against the sodden ground, his eye locked to the scope of his Springfield rifle. Water cascaded down his face in rivers, dripping from his nose, streaming into his eyes, but he did not blink, he did not move, he barely breathed. October 14th, 1942, 6 hours into what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Beside him, Private First Class Elliot Bancroft lay equally still, but for a different reason. Blood seeped from a wound in his shoulder, mixing with the rain and mud to form a dark pool beneath him. His face had gone pale, his breathing came shallow and quick. The pain was written in every line of his features, but he made no sound. He knew sound meant death. 3 Japanese snipers had triangulated their position with mathematical precision. Any movement, any attempt to crawl toward cover or reach the radio 5 yards behind them would be met with instant death. They were pinned, trapped, waiting for the end. Below them, through the curtain of tropical rain, a valley held secrets that would haunt American forces for months to come. 24 Japanese soldiers stood in formation around bamboo structures, learning techniques that would make them the deadliest marksmen in the Pacific. Their instructor, a tall figure demonstrating shooting positions with calm authority, had no idea he was being watched. Elliot turned his head a fraction of an inch, just enough to whisper through gritted teeth.
"There's one shot, the instructor. Take him and the whole place might scatter."
Silas studied the distant figure through his scope. He knew the mathematics without calculating. 847 yards in torrential rain with winds gusting unpredictably from multiple directions. No sniper in the history of the Marine Corps had ever confirmed a kill in such conditions at this distance. The shot was beyond the effective range of his rifle in perfect weather. In a tropical monsoon, it was suicide. "If I miss, we're dead," Silas breathed.
"If you don't shoot, we're dead anyway," Elliot replied, his voice tight with pain. "And so are hundreds more Marines after us."
The rain continued to fall. The blood continued to seep from Elliot's shoulder. And somewhere in the valley below, 24 future killers absorbed lessons that would cost American lives across the entire theater. In that moment, as Silas's finger found the trigger, he could not know that his next action would save his partner's life, disrupt an entire enemy program, and change sniper doctrine for generations to come. But to understand how a farm boy from Indiana came to attempt the impossible, we must go back. Back to a time when a single bullet meant the difference between eating and going hungry. Back to a childhood where missing was never an option. Silas Hartwell entered the world on July 2nd, 1920, the third son of Nathan and Ruth Hartwell on a struggling dairy farm outside Bloomington, Indiana. The farm had never been prosperous. The soil was stubborn, the weather unpredictable, the markets indifferent to the labor of small farmers. When the Great Depression swept across America like a biblical plague in 1929, the Hartwells were already barely surviving. Now they were drowning. Nathan Hartwell was a man carved from silence and hard work. He rose before dawn and labored until after dark, wresting sustenance from land that seemed determined to defeat him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words carried the weight of absolute finality. Ruth Hartwell matched her husband's labor hour for hour, stretching every resource mending clothes until they could be mended no more, making meals from ingredients that seemed impossibly meager. They had 5 children to feed. Most nights, none of those children went to bed with a full stomach. Young Silas learned early that childhood in the Hartwell household was not a time of play or leisure. It was a time of contribution. By age 6, he was feeding chickens. By 7, he was helping with the dairy cows. And by 9, in the bitter autumn of 1929, his father decided he was ready for a different kind of responsibility. One morning before sunrise, Nathan Hartwell called his third son outside. Silas found his father standing by the barn, holding a weathered Remington rifle that looked older than the farm itself. The stock had been worn smooth by generations of hands. The barrel showed the patina of decades. Nathan handed the rifle to his son without ceremony. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a single brass cartridge. "You bring back something, or you bring back the bullet." His voice carried no emotion, no encouragement, no room for negotiation. "But you better bring back something. Your sister is hungry." Silas stared at the rifle in his small hands. It felt impossibly heavy. "1 bullet, Si. 1 bullet every morning. That's what we can afford." His father turned and walked back toward the house. No instructions on how to shoot, no lessons on how to hunt, no explanation of how a 9-year-old boy was supposed to feed a family with a single round of ammunition. Silas stood alone in the grey morning light, the rifle in his hands, that single bullet in his pocket, and understood something that would define the rest of his life. He was not allowed to miss. Inside the house, his younger sister Clara sat at the kitchen table. She was 6 years old, with eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. When Silas came in for breakfast that first morning, she looked up at him with an expression that asked questions she was too young to voice. Those eyes held trust, hunger, and an unspoken faith that her big brother would provide. Those eyes would haunt Silas for years. The first week nearly broke him. Silas wandered the Indiana woods from dawn until dusk, that lone bullet burning against his leg like an accusation. He saw rabbits, but they were too far away. He spotted squirrels, but they moved too quickly. Each time he raised the rifle, his hands trembled with the terrible knowledge that if he fired and missed, his family would have no meat that night. On the third day, he came home with the bullet still unfired. Clara looked up at him with those eyes. She didn't ask why there was no meat. She didn't complain. She simply looked at him with complete trust, and that trust cut deeper than any accusation could have. That night dinner was cornmeal mush. No meat, no protein. Just ground corn in water. Silas lay awake for hours, staring at the darkness above his bed, feeling the weight of failure crushing his chest. He thought about Clara's eyes. He thought about his mother's tired face as she served the meager meal. He thought about his father's silence, which somehow felt worse than any scolding. He made himself a promise in that darkness. He would never come home empty-handed again, not while Clara and the others were counting on him. The next morning, something changed in Silas Hartwell. Instead of wandering hopefully through the forest, he began to study it. He sat motionless for hours, watching how rabbits moved through the underbrush, learning their patterns and pathways. He observed squirrels climbing their familiar trees, noting the specific branches where they always paused. He felt the wind against his cheek and watched how it bent the grass in waves, teaching him what lay beyond his immediate sight. Most importantly, he learned patience. With only one bullet, he could not afford to take a shot at 50 yards, when patience might bring the target to 20. He could not fire at a running animal when a stationary opportunity might present itself in another hour. He learned to wait, to breathe, to become as still and silent as the trees surrounding him. And he learned something else. He learned to hunt in the rain. Other boys ran for shelter when storms came. They complained about the wet, the cold, the misery. But Silas discovered that rain was an advantage. The sound of falling water masked his footsteps. Animals grew less cautious in the downpour, focused on finding shelter rather than watching for predators. Visibility decreased, allowing him to get closer before taking his shot. While others saw rain as an obstacle, Silas saw it as an ally. By age 10, Silas rarely returned without game. By age 12, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to calculate distance and wind without conscious thought. He would raise the rifle, make adjustments that felt automatic, and fire. The target would fall. His father never said the words, "good job," or "I'm proud of you." Nathan Hartwell was not built for such expressions. But sometimes, when Silas brought back a particularly difficult catch, his father would look at him and nod once, just a small movement of the head, barely perceptible. Those nods sustained Silas more than any praise ever could. The Hartwell family could not afford to keep Silas in school past the 8th grade. Money was needed at home, not spent on education that would not put food on the table. So at 14 in 1934, Silas left the classroom forever and began an apprenticeship with his Uncle Owen Hartwell, a carpenter and part-time gunsmith in town. Uncle Owen was everything Nathan Hartwell was not. Where Silas's father communicated through silence and expectation, Owen talked constantly, explaining everything he did in exhaustive detail. He seemed physically incapable of working without also teaching. "A bullet doesn't fly straight, Si," Owen said one afternoon, holding up a cartridge and turning it in the light. "People think it does, but that's foolishness. The moment it leaves your barrel, gravity starts pulling it down. Wind pushes it sideways. Humidity affects how fast it travels. Temperature changes how the powder burns." Silas listened to every word, absorbing knowledge he had learned through instinct but never understood through science. "Most folks point and shoot," Owen continued, adjusting the scope on a customer's rifle. "Works fine at close range, but you want to hit something far away. You need to understand what that bullet is doing during every moment of its flight." When customers brought rifles into the shop for repair or scope adjustment, uncle and nephew would test fire them together in the field behind the building. Owen would quiz Silas constantly. 300 yards, wind from the right, maybe 8 miles per hour, temperature about 60 degrees. What adjustment? Silas would study the target, feel the wind, consider the conditions. Then he would fire. The target would fall. One afternoon, Owen watched Silas make a shot that should have required complex calculations performed in seconds. The boy had simply raised the rifle, paused for a heartbeat, and fired.
perfect hit. How did you calculate that adjustment? Owen asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Silas shrugged. I didn't calculate. I just knew where to aim. Owen was quiet for a long moment, studying his nephew with new eyes. You have a gift, Si. I've worked with shooters my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what you do. It's like the physics is built into your bones. He paused, his expression growing serious. But gifts like this can be blessings or curses depending on how they're used. Silas did not fully understand his uncle's warning. Not then. He would understand years later on an island far from Indiana when that gift would be tested against impossible odds. December 7th, 1941. Silas was 21 years old, working at a construction site in Indianapolis, earning decent wages as a journeyman carpenter. For the first time in his life, he had money to spare. He sent most of it home to help his aging parents and to ensure Clara, now 18, could finish high school. He was mixing mortar when someone shouted for everyone to gather around the foreman's radio. Workers dropped their tools and clustered around the crackling device, listening in stunned silence as the announcer described the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burning, planes falling from the sky, thousands of American sailors and soldiers dead or dying. The next morning, Silas walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station. The line stretched out the door and down the block. Young men from every walk of life waiting to serve. "Why Marines?" the recruiter asked when Silas finally reached the desk. "My grandfather served with the Marines in the Great War," Silas replied. "He always said if you're going to fight, fight with the best." Basic training at Parris Island separated the men who wanted to serve from the men who could serve. The heat, the humidity, the relentless demands of the drill instructors broke recruit after recruit. Silas endured it all with the patience he had learned hunting rabbits in the Indiana woods. But it was his marksmanship that caught attention. On the rifle range, while other recruits struggled to hit man-sized targets at 300 yards, Silas consistently placed shots in groups smaller than a playing card. His scores were so unusual that the range officer suspected his targets were being miscounted. They were not. "Son, where did you learn to shoot like that?" his drill instructor demanded, after one demonstration that left the entire training platoon speechless. "Hungry siblings, sir," Silas replied simply. "Either I hit what I aimed at, or we didn't eat that night." The story spread through the barracks within hours. Silas Hartwell, the Indiana farm boy who never missed because his family had been too poor to waste ammunition on second chances. The Marines recognized exceptional talent when they saw it. They pulled Silas from regular infantry training and placed him in an experimental sniper program. Here, instructors with advanced degrees in mathematics and physics tried to teach him the science behind what he already did by instinct. Silas learned new vocabulary: Coriolis effect, barometric pressure, ballistic coefficient. But when the time came to shoot, he relied on the same intuition that had fed his family through the Depression. His instructors noticed something remarkable. Silas often made correct adjustments before completing calculations on paper. It was as if his hands knew the answer before his mind had finished the question. "He doesn't follow the manual," one instructor wrote in his evaluation, "but his results are beyond anything I've seen." The question is whether we can teach what he does by nature. In June of 1942, Silas completed his training and received his assignment. 1st Marine Division, preparing for Operation Watchtower, the invasion of Guadalcanal. His designated spotter was a man who appeared to be his opposite in every conceivable way. Elliot Bancroft came from Boston from a family of academics and intellectuals. His father held a professorship in mathematics at Harvard. His mother hosted salon gatherings where guests debated philosophy and politics over expensive wine. Elliot had grown up surrounded by books, ideas, and the comfortable assumption that the mind could solve any problem. He graduated from Harvard with honors in physics, then began pursuing his master's degree. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, he abandoned his studies and enlisted, believing his analytical skills could contribute to the war effort. Before joining the Marines, Elliot Bancroft had never fired a gun in his life. The first meeting between spotter and shooter did not go smoothly. "You're my spotter?" Silas asked, eyeing the well-groomed Bostonian with undisguised skepticism. "And you're my shooter," Elliot replied, his accent marking him as East Coast educated. "They tell me you make shots that defy explanation. I'm here to figure out how." "Figure out how," Silas repeated. "I just shoot." "What's there to figure out?" "The mathematics, the physics. There must be a system behind what you do. If we can understand it, we can replicate it, teach it to others." Silas shook his head slowly. "There's no system. I see the target. I know where to aim. I pull the trigger." "That's impossible," Elliot insisted. "There are always calculations.
Wind speed, distance, humidity, temperature. The variables are too complex for pure instinct. Then call it impossible, Silas said flatly.
I still hit what I aim at. The tension between them simmered for weeks. Elliot filled notebooks with observations and equations trying to decode Silas's intuitive process. Silas grew increasingly frustrated with his spotter's endless questions and theoretical discussions. Harvard here thinks shooting is geometry, Silas remarked to another Marine one evening, making no effort to lower his voice. Indiana thinks it's witchcraft, Elliot shot back from across the tent. But his witchcraft seems to work, so I'm learning to speak his language. The breakthrough came during a training exercise 3 weeks before deployment. They were tasked with eliminating a target at 600 yards in shifting wind conditions. Silas studied the target through his scope, feeling the wind change against his face. He began adjusting his scope.
Wait, Elliot said suddenly. Silas froze. The wind is cycling. Elliot continued, his eyes on his notes.
Strong gust, short pause, light breeze from the opposite direction. We're in the pause now. The light breeze will come from the left in about 3 seconds. Silas held his position waiting. 3 heartbeats later, he felt gentle air movement against his right cheek. Wind from the left, exactly as predicted. He fired. The target fell. Elliot allowed himself a small smile. You see, you're the trigger. I'm the scope. Separate, we're incomplete. Together, we're something more.
Something shifted between them after that exercise. Silas began to appreciate how Elliot's analytical mind could predict conditions he could only react to. Elliot began to understand that Silas's instinct was not magic, but experience compressed so deeply it had become automatic. By the time they landed on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, they had developed the wordless communication essential for a successful sniper team. In their first 2 months of combat, they accumulated 37 confirmed kills, operating deep behind enemy lines to eliminate Japanese officers and disrupt supply operations. They had become legends, and they had become friends. On October 13th, 1942, early evening, Silas and Elliot were summoned to division headquarters, a cramped tent that smelled of sweat canvas and cigarette smoke. Colonel Robert Morrison, the operations officer, briefed them personally with a map spread across a folding table. 3 days ago, we sent a reconnaissance team to investigate reports of unusual Japanese activity in this sector, Morrison said, tapping a point on the map. Lieutenant Jennings led 8 men into that jungle. 4 came back. Jennings himself took a bullet through the arm. He paused, letting the numbers speak for themselves. What Jennings reported was disturbing.
A training facility. Japanese soldiers learning sniper techniques that appear to be German in origin. If his report is accurate, we're facing a threat that could cost us hundreds of casualties. What do you need from us, sir? Silas asked. Intelligence. I need you to infiltrate to this location, confirm the facility exists, observe its operations, and return with actionable information. Morrison's eyes hardened. Observe only. No engagement under any circumstances unless your lives are in immediate danger. This is reconnaissance, not assault. Understood. Understood, sir. Weather forecast predicts heavy rain. That should help with concealment. Morrison folded the map. You depart at 0300 tomorrow. As they left the headquarters tent, Elliot caught Silas's arm. Jennings lost half his team, he said quietly, and they were just observing from a distance. Silas nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the jungle darkness to the northwest. Somewhere in that blackness, 24 men were learning to kill his fellow Marines with terrible efficiency. I know. So, what are you thinking? Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of premonition. I'm thinking, this isn't going to be a routine reconnaissance. My gut tells me we're not just going to observe. Elliot said nothing. He had learned to trust Silas's instincts, even when they pointed toward danger. The next morning, before the first grey light of dawn, they slipped into the jungle carrying only essentials. Weapons, 3 days of rations, a radio, and faith in each other. Neither man knew that within hours a single bullet would change everything, that a shot most would call impossible would determine whether they lived or died, that the lessons learned in Indiana poverty, refined through Marine training, tested through months of combat, would face their ultimate examination on a rain-soaked ridge overlooking a valley of death. The jungle swallowed them whole, and the clock began ticking toward the moment when Silas Hartwell would have to make a choice: follow orders and watch his partner die, or attempt the impossible and change the course of the war. The jungle swallowed them before the first light of dawn touched the horizon. Silas Hartwell moved through the darkness with the patience he had learned hunting rabbits in Indiana. Each footstep placed with deliberate care on ground he could barely see. Behind him, Elliot Bancroft followed in his tracks,
stepping exactly where Silas stepped, breathing when Silas breathed. October 14th, 1942, 0300 hours. They had left American lines under cover of absolute blackness, using the night to slip past Japanese pickets that would have spotted them in daylight. Their equipment was minimal: rifles, ammunition, 3 days of rations, canteens, a radio, maps, a spotting scope, and a waterproof journal for recording observations. Everything else had been left behind. Speed and silence mattered more than comfort. The first hours passed without incident. They navigated by compass through vegetation so dense that visibility sometimes dropped to less than 10 feet. Vines grabbed at their ankles, roots threatened to trip them with every step. The humid air pressed against their lungs like a wet blanket, making each breath feel like drowning in slow motion. Around mid-morning, the rain began. It started as a light drizzle, almost pleasant after hours of oppressive humidity. Within an hour, it had intensified into the torrential downpour typical of the Solomon Islands in October. Water fell from the sky in sheets so thick that Silas could barely see Elliot 3 feet behind him. By noon, they were soaked to the bone, wading through mud that sometimes reached their knees. Their uniforms clung to their bodies like second skins. Water streamed down their faces and into their eyes. Every piece of equipment not wrapped in waterproof covering became saturated.
"This rain might be the only reason we're still alive," Elliot whispered during a brief rest, his voice barely audible above the drumming of water on leaves.
"Japanese patrols would normally blanket this entire sector." Silas nodded agreement. The downpour masked the sounds of their movement and reduced visibility to almost nothing. It was miserable, but it was also protection, just like hunting deer in Indiana storms. While others took shelter, he moved. They pressed forward. At approximately 1300 hours, they began ascending a ridge that intelligence suggested would overlook the valley where the sniper school was reportedly located. The climb was treacherous. Rain had turned the slope into a cascade of mud and loose stones. Vegetation that might have provided handholds instead pulled free from the saturated soil. Halfway up the ridge, Silas froze. He raised his fist in the universal signal to halt, and Elliot stopped instantly behind him. Ahead, barely visible through the curtain of rain, a Japanese sentry post clung to the trees. A small bamboo platform, elevated perhaps 15 feet above the ground, occupied by 2 soldiers, huddled miserably under a makeshift canopy that did little to keep out the driving water. Silas's heart pounded against his ribs. The sentries were perhaps 30 yards away, close enough to hear a careless footstep, close enough to see movement if they looked in the right direction at the right moment. For 15 excruciating minutes, Silas and Elliot remained absolutely motionless. Rain streamed down their camouflaged forms as they became part of the jungle, indistinguishable from the vegetation surrounding them. Silas controlled his breathing with conscious effort, drawing air slowly through his nose, releasing it just as slowly through barely parted lips. The Japanese sentries, more concerned with staying dry than maintaining vigilance, huddled together under their inadequate shelter. They spoke occasionally in low voices. Complaints about the weather, complaints about duty, the universal grumbling of soldiers everywhere. They never looked toward the 2 Americans frozen in the undergrowth, barely a stone's throw away. When one sentry finally turned his back to adjust the canopy, Silas touched Elliot on the shoulder. They moved inch by careful inch. They circumvented the position, adding an hour to their journey, but avoiding detection. First close call. Silas suspected it would not be the last. By 1500 hours, they had reached a position near the crest of the ridge. Elliot deployed the spotting scope while Silas established a hasty hide using vegetation and their camouflaged tarpaulin to create a concealed observation post. Through breaks in the rain, they caught their first glimpses of the valley below. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. "That's not improvised training," Elliot whispered, his eye pressed to the scope.
"That's a professional sniper school."
The facility was larger and more sophisticated than Lieutenant Jennings had reported. 7 bamboo structures formed a rough semicircle around what was clearly a dedicated training area. Despite the downpour, instruction was ongoing. Silas counted the figures below. 25 to 30 Japanese soldiers engaged in various drills. Some practiced concealment techniques, working with local vegetation to create ghillie suits similar to those used by American and British snipers. Others stood at a crude firing range, engaging targets under the watchful eye of an instructor. Silas focused his rifle scope on that instructor. The man was tall for a Japanese officer, with the bearing of absolute authority. He moved among his students, demonstrating shooting positions, correcting stances, adjusting grips. His movements were precise, economical, professional, and completely wrong. "He's not using Japanese methods," Silas said quietly. Elliot studied the instructor through his scope. "You're right.
Those are German techniques. Look at his shooting position. That's Wehrmacht methodology. I've seen it in training manuals. This was a disturbing development. German snipers on the Eastern Front had earned a reputation for lethal efficiency that terrified Soviet soldiers. If Japanese forces were adopting German techniques adapted for jungle warfare, American casualties would multiply exponentially. "We need to document everything," Elliot said, already reaching for the journal. "Every structure, every training method, every piece of equipment we can identify." For the next hour, they meticulously recorded their observations: the layout of the facility, the number of personnel, the training rotations, the equipment visible through the rain. Their mission was to observe only, and despite the clear threat the facility represented, they maintained discipline. The plan was simple: complete observation. As darkness fell, then begin the return journey under cover of night. Deliver the intelligence to command. Let others decide what to do with it. At 16:32 hours, the plan collapsed. Elliot shifted position slightly, trying to get a better angle on the eastern side of the facility. His boot dislodged a small stone that tumbled down the ridge, clicking against other rocks as it fell. The sound would have been inaudible under normal circumstances. The rain should have masked it completely. But one of the Japanese trainees below, displaying the heightened awareness that marked an exceptional sniper, reacted to the anomaly. His head snapped up. He stared directly at the ridge where the Americans lay hidden. Within seconds, he was speaking urgently to others around him. Within a minute, 3 Japanese soldiers were moving up the slope to investigate. "We need to move," Silas whispered, already gathering their observation notes. "No time," Elliot replied, his voice tight with controlled fear. "They've got the approaches covered. Look." He was right. The Japanese were executing a textbook search pattern. 2 men advancing, while a third provided overwatch from below. Any movement now would trigger immediate detection and gunfire. Their only option was to remain perfectly still and pray the search would be cursory. For 20 agonizing minutes, Silas and Elliot did not move a single muscle. They became statues. They became part of the ridge. Rain streamed over their motionless forms as Japanese soldiers searched methodically along the ridgeline, passing within 10 yards of their position. The rain, which had lightened briefly, returned with renewed intensity. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The searching soldiers, visibly miserable in the downpour, began to lose enthusiasm for their task. After a final scan of the area, they started back down the slope. Relief flooded through Silas's chest. They had survived. They could still complete the mission. The relief lasted exactly 3 seconds. As the search party descended, Elliot shifted his weight fractionally to ease a cramping muscle. It was an infinitesimal movement, a fraction of an inch. Something no human eye should have been able to detect through the rain at distance. A Japanese sniper positioned specifically to watch for exactly such telltale movements saw it. The crack of the rifle reached them a heartbeat after the bullet struck Elliot in the shoulder. The impact threw him backward with brutal force. Silas reacted on pure instinct, grabbing his partner and dragging him deeper into their hide as 2 more shots tore through the vegetation inches from their position. "How bad?" Silas demanded, his voice a barely audible whisper as he pressed his hand against the wound. "Through and through," Elliot gasped, his face contorted with pain. "But they've got us pinned. 3 shooters minimum, interlocking fields of fire." Below them, the training facility had erupted into organized chaos. The instructor was directing his students with calm hand signals, deploying them into positions for a coordinated assault up the ridge. Silas counted at least 24 figures moving with deadly purpose. 24 trained or training snipers, all focused on 2 Americans trapped on an exposed hillside. Their radio lay just outside their current position, knocked aside when Silas had pulled Elliot to safety. Reaching it meant exposing himself to enemy fire. Without it, they had no way to call for support. Elliot's wound was bleeding steadily. In the tropical conditions of Guadalcanal, infection would begin within hours without proper treatment. "We can't move," Elliot said, his voice strained but analytical even through the pain. "We can't call for help. They know exactly where we are and they're organizing to finish us." Silas surveyed their situation with the cold clarity that came over him in moments of crisis. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Stay hidden, and Elliot would bleed out while the Japanese closed in for the kill. Try to escape, and they would be cut down before covering 10 yards. Call for extraction, and no help would arrive in time. There was only one option that offered any chance at all, and it was an option that defied everything the Marine Corps had taught him about reasonable engagement. Silas settled behind his rifle and studied the valley below, 847 yards to the instructor, beyond the effective range of his Springfield in perfect conditions. In this rain, with these winds, It was a shot that existed only in the realm of theory. "What are you thinking?" Elliot asked, watching Silas's face. "Something that probably won't work." Elliot followed Silas's gaze to the distant figure still directing his students with calm authority. Understanding dawned on his pain-glazed features. 847 yards, Elliot said, his voice flat.
In torrential rain with gusting crosswinds. That's beyond impossible. That's fantasy. I know. If you miss every sniper down there, we'll know exactly where we are. They'll concentrate fire on this position and tear us apart. I know. No one has ever made a confirmed kill in these conditions at this range. No one. The variables are too numerous. The margin for error is too small. Even if your aim is perfect, a gust of wind or a heavy sheet of rain could push the bullet yards off target. Silas finally looked away from his scope to meet his partner's eyes. "Elliot, if I don't take this shot, we die here. You'll bleed out before nightfall, and they'll overrun our position before dawn. And after we're dead, 24 trained snipers will be unleashed across this island to kill Marines for months to come." He paused, letting the weight of the situation settle between them. One bullet, one chance, same as it's always been. Elliot stared at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. The doubt faded, replaced by the professional focus of a man who had accepted the impossible as the only option. "Talk to me then," Elliot said. "Give me the mathematics." Silas turned back to his scope. 847 yards. Elevation adjustment. Elliot closed his eyes, calculating despite his wound. Approximately 15 minutes of angle up, accounting for the downward angle. Wind, right to left, estimated 12 to 15 miles per hour. That's another 8 minutes of angle adjustment into the wind. He paused. But it's gusting. Inconsistent. Could be stronger, could be weaker, could shift direction entirely. "And the rain," Silas said. This time Elliot hesitated longer. "There's no formula for this. The rain will catch the bullet, slow it down, pull it off trajectory. My best estimate is another 3 minutes of angle of drop, maybe more, maybe less." He opened his eyes, meeting Silas's gaze directly. "I'm guessing psi. Educated guessing based on physics. I've never actually tested this. The shot is beyond anything in the manuals. We're hoping together and praying." Silas made minute adjustments to his scope, his fingers moving with the precision of long practice. As he prepared, time seemed to slow. The rain faded to background noise. The jungle disappeared. His awareness narrowed to the fundamental elements of shooting he had practiced since childhood. Breath control, trigger pressure, sight alignment. He thought of hunting rabbits in Indiana rain, of his father's unspoken lessons about patience and precision, of Uncle Owen teaching him that physics lived in his bones, of Clara's eyes looking up at him, trusting him to provide. He thought of Elliot bleeding beside him, of 24 killers waiting below, of the hundreds of Marines who would die if those killers completed their training. One bullet. One chance. Same as it had always been since that first morning when his father handed him a rifle and a single cartridge. He was no longer aiming at where the instructor stood. He was aiming at a point in empty space. A point where, if his calculations and instincts were correct, target and bullet would intersect more than a second after he fired. This was not mathematics. This was not physics. This was something deeper, something born from years of necessity and refined through months of combat. It was the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 shots compressed into a single moment of absolute clarity. Breath in, hold, slight pressure on the trigger. Below, the Japanese instructor continued his lecture, explaining to his students how to coordinate an assault, how to approach and eliminate trapped enemy snipers, teaching them lessons of death. Breath out, hold, squeeze. The Springfield cracked its report, partially muffled by the downpour. Through his scope, Silas tracked the minute disturbance in the rain as his bullet cut through the air, a tiny ripple in the sheets of falling water marking its invisible path. For an eternal moment, nothing happened. The instructor continued his lecture. The students remained focused on his words. The rain continued to fall. Then, 847 yards away, the instructor suddenly staggered backward. His hands went to his chest, his knees buckled. He collapsed to the muddy ground. A perfect shot. A bullet that had traveled for nearly a full second through sheeting rain and gusting wind to find its mark. The impossible made real. The reaction below was immediate and unexpected. Rather than returning fire or diving for cover, the Japanese sniper trainees scattered in confusion. They had just witnessed something their training told them was impossible.
Their instructor, their master, struck down by an invisible marksman in conditions that should have made such a shot unthinkable. Panic replaced discipline. Shouted orders contradicted each other. Some men ran for the structures.
Others dropped prone and aimed wildly at the ridge. 3 remained frozen in shock, unable to process what they had seen. Lieutenant Koji Sato, the most promising of Colonel Yamada's students, stared at the ridge where he could see nothing but rain and jungle. His mind refused to accept what his eyes had witnessed. 847 meters. In these conditions, impossible. But Colonel Yamada lay dead in the mud, proving that the impossible had become real. "Now," Silas hissed.
Elliot moved, despite his wound rolling toward the radio with desperate speed. His good hand closed around the device as bullets began striking their former position. The Japanese, recovering from their initial shock, were returning fire. "Foxhole 3, this is Spectre Team," Elliot gasped into the radio, blood from his shoulder smearing the handset. "Emergency extraction required. 1 wounded. Coordinates follow." He rattled off their position using the encrypted grid system, his voice strained but clear. The response came immediately. "Spectre Team, Foxhole 3. Nearest QRF is engaged. No assets available for extraction. Suggest you establish defensive position and await opportunity." In other words, they were on their own. Silas used the window of confusion to eliminate 2 of the Japanese snipers who had them pinned. His shots were precise and lethal. The 3rd shooter had abandoned his position, retreating down the slope. For the moment, they had an escape route. "Can you move?" Silas asked, already reaching for their essential equipment. "Do I have a choice?" Elliot replied through gritted teeth. They gathered what they could carry. Rifles, ammunition, the radio, and the waterproof journal containing their observations. The journal had fallen outside their covered position when Elliot was shot. Silas belly-crawled to the edge of their hide, reached out with his rifle barrel, and carefully dragged the book back to safety. "Intelligence needs to know exactly what we saw," he explained, securing it in his pack. "Especially now that we've stirred up the hornet's nest." What Silas could not know, what American intelligence would only piece together weeks later through intercepted communications, was that his impossible shot had triggered consequences far beyond their immediate survival. The instructor he had killed was Colonel Takeshi Yamada, one of Japan's foremost sniper experts, the man who had studied with German marksmen before the war, the architect of a program designed to multiply Japanese sniper capabilities across the entire Pacific theater. With Yamada dead, killed by a shot that defied everything his students had been taught was possible, the carefully constructed training program collapsed into chaos. There was no clear chain of command. No one with the knowledge or authority to continue the instruction. No one capable of explaining how their invincible master had fallen to an invisible enemy. Lieutenant Sato stood in the rain, watching his fellow students mill about in confusion. "What do we do?" one of them asked, his voice cracking with fear. Sato had no answer. Their master had taught them techniques and tactics. He had not taught them how to respond when those techniques and tactics proved insufficient against an enemy who operated beyond the boundaries of reason. The hunt for the American snipers would be confused, disorganized, ultimately ineffective. Fear had replaced confidence. Mythology had replaced training. The ghost marksman on the ridge had become something more than human in the minds of the surviving Japanese. And that mythology would save Silas Hartwell and Elliot Bancroft in the desperate hours ahead. The escape began as a controlled scramble down the eastern slope of the ridge. Silas went first, half carrying Elliot, whose strength was fading with every passing minute. Rain made the descent treacherous. Rocks shifted beneath their feet. Vegetation that might have provided handholds tore free from the saturated soil. Japanese fire followed them, bullets cracking through the foliage overhead, thudding into trees around them. But the combination of rain, failing light, and their rapid movement made them difficult targets. After descending perhaps 200 yards, they paused in a dense thicket of ferns to assess their situation. Elliot was weakening visibly. His face had gone grey. His breathing came in shallow gasps. The wound continued to bleed despite Silas's efforts to maintain pressure during their movement. "They'll come after us," Elliot said between laboured breaths. "We've hurt them badly. They'll want revenge." Silas nodded grimly. "They're also professionals. They'll track us methodically, try to cut us off before we reach our lines." He checked his compass, calculating their position. The safe route back to American lines would take hours they did not have. But there was a shorter path, more direct, more dangerous. Cutting through territory where Japanese activity had been reported. Risk the shorter route and possibly encounter enemy forces. Take the longer route and definitely watch his partner die. Silas chose the shorter path. He lifted Elliot in a fireman's carry, the wounded man's weight settling across his shoulders. It was exhausting. It was probably impossible to maintain for the distance required.
but impossible had already proven flexible tonight, one step at a time, just like hunting deer in Indiana.
Just like everything his father had taught him without words. At approximately 0100 hours on October 15th, navigating a narrow ravine in near total darkness, Silas realized too late that they had entered a minefield. His foot had already descended toward the ground when the faint moonlight revealed the telltale shape of a buried explosive barely 6 inches from where his boot would land. He froze mid-step, balanced precariously on one leg. Elliot's unconscious weight threatening to topple them both. Sweat broke out across Silas's forehead that had nothing to do with exertion. He scanned the ground ahead with agonizing care. In the dim light, he could make out at least 3 more mines within his direct line of sight. There were almost certainly others hidden in the shadows. One wrong step would kill them both. "Elliot," Silas said quietly. "Elliot, I need you to wake up." No response. "Elliot," more urgently now. "I need your eyes. Wake up." Elliot stirred on his shoulders, mumbling something incoherent. "Listen to me. We're in a minefield. I can't see well enough to find a path through. I need you to look. I need you to help me." Something in Silas's voice penetrated the fog of fever and delirium. Elliot raised his head slightly, blinking against the darkness. "Minefield," he whispered, his voice weak, confused but present. "Can you see the ground? Can you spot the mines?" Elliot squinted at the terrain below them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, his analytical mind began to function again, fighting through the illness that clouded it. 3 o'clock, he said softly. 2 steps. There's one buried just under the surface. I can see the edge. Silas adjusted his intended path. 12 o'clock. 1 step. Another one. The rain-exposed part of the casing. Silas corrected again. 9 o'clock. 3 steps, and another at 11 o'clock, maybe 4 steps beyond that. Elliot's voice grew slightly stronger as he focused on the puzzle before him. "There's a path. Narrow, but it's there. You need to go left first, then right, then straight for about 10 feet. Step by step, with Elliot spotting from his perch on Silas's shoulders, they navigated through the minefield. 20 minutes of excruciating progress, each footfall a commitment that could not be taken back. When they finally cleared the last mine and reached safe ground, Silas lowered Elliot gently and allowed himself to lean against a tree, gasping for breath. "Good work, Harvard," he managed between gulps of air. Elliot, slumping against the tree beside him, managed a weak smile. "Indiana saved my life twice tonight. Figured I owed you one." At approximately 0200 hours, they established radio contact with an American patrol operating forward of the main defensive positions. Lieutenant Thomas Westmore led the patrol, a 10-man unit, dispatched specifically to search for the missing sniper team after their earlier distress call. "We thought you boys were finished," Westmore said, after linking up with them at the coordinates they had transmitted. "When we heard you'd run into a Japanese sniper nest, nobody gave you much chance." "They didn't give us much chance either," Silas replied, helping transfer Elliot to a stretcher brought by Westmore's men. "They made a mistake." "What's that?" Silas looked back toward the jungle that had nearly killed them, thinking of the shot that had changed everything. "They assumed what I did was impossible, so when I did it, they didn't know how to respond." Elliot was evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons worked through the night to clean his wound and fight the infection that had taken hold. It was close, closer than anyone told Silas until much later. But Elliot Bancroft survived. Silas, exhausted but uninjured, delivered their observation journal directly to intelligence officers at division headquarters. The next morning, October 15th, 1942, Silas stood before Colonel Morrison in the operations tent. The journal lay open on the table between them. "Colonel Yamada," Morrison said, reading from an intelligence brief. "One of Japan's foremost sniper experts, trained in Berlin before the war. The architect of a program designed to exponentially expand their sniper capabilities across the Pacific." He looked up at Silas. "You killed him with a single shot, 847 yards, in a typhoon." "Yes, sir." "The program has collapsed. 24 trainees scattered into the jungle, leaderless, demoralized, but still dangerous." Morrison studied Silas with an expression that mixed respect and calculation. "Intelligence has tracked some of them to positions north of here. They're a significant threat, highly trained, highly motivated, and now highly afraid of an American ghost who shoots through storms." He paused. "We need someone to finish what you started." Silas understood what was being asked. "I'll bring them back, sir, dead or alive." Morrison nodded slowly. "You depart at first light. 4 days. Make them disappear." As Silas left the tent, He thought about the 24 men scattered in the jungle. 24 students of a dead master. 24 threats to his fellow Marines. And he thought about rain. How others saw it as an obstacle. How he saw it as an advantage. The hunt was about to begin. The rain came again on the morning of October 15th, as if the island itself had decided to conspire with Silas Hartwell. Heavy clouds rolled in from the ocean, turning the sky the color of old iron. By the time he left the American perimeter, water was falling in steady sheets, transforming the jungle into a world of shadow and sound. He carried minimal gear. His Springfield rifle, 200 rounds of ammunition, 4 days of rations, 3 canteens, a compass, a map marked with the last known positions of the scattered Japanese trainees, and the knowledge that had been beaten into him since he was 9 years old, hunting in Indiana rain while his sister went hungry. Rain was not his enemy. Rain was his weapon. Colonel Morrison had been clear in the briefing that morning. Colonel Yamada is confirmed dead. You eliminated 2 more during your escape. That leaves 22 trained snipers scattered across this sector, leaderless, demoralized, but still extremely dangerous. Morrison had tapped the map with one finger. 4 days, Corporal. Make them disappear. Silas had nodded. 22 men. 4 days. He had hunted with worse odds in Indiana when Clara was hungry and the family was counting on him. The first day he moved like a ghost through terrain that would have stopped most men. While Japanese patrols huddled in makeshift shelters waiting for the storm to pass, Silas used the downpour as cover. The sound of water on leaves masked his footsteps. The reduced visibility allowed him to move through areas that would have been suicide in clear weather. The misery of the conditions meant sentries were focused on staying dry, not watching for threats. Intelligence had tracked 6 of the scattered trainees to a valley 4 miles northwest of the training facility. They had taken shelter in an abandoned Japanese supply depot, a cluster of 3 buildings surrounded by dense jungle. Lieutenant Koji Sato commanded them, the most promising of Colonel Yamada's students now thrust into leadership he had never been trained for. Silas found them by mid-afternoon. He established an observation position on high ground overlooking the depot, settling into the mud and vegetation with the patience of a man who had once waited 3 hours for a rabbit to move within range. Through his scope, he studied their patterns, their movements, their routines. They were skilled, well-trained, but they were also afraid. He could see it in the way they checked shadows, in the way they startled at sounds that meant nothing. The impossible shot that had killed their master had planted seeds of doubt that were now bearing fruit. At dusk, as visibility dropped to almost nothing in the rain and gathering darkness, Silas moved. The first sentry never saw him. One moment the young Japanese soldier was standing at his post rifle, ready eyes scanning the jungle. The next moment he was on the ground dead from a bullet that had come from nowhere. The second sentry heard the shot, turned, raised his weapon. Silas's bullet took him in the chest before he could call out. Inside the central building, Lieutenant Sato heard the gunfire. His blood turned to ice. 2 shots, 2 of his men. And in this rain, in this darkness, they were blind. Defensive positions, Sato ordered, his voice cracking despite his efforts to maintain control. Back to back. Watch all approaches. The 4 remaining men clustered together in the center of the building, rifles pointed outward, waiting, listening, hearing nothing but rain. Silas circled the building in the darkness. Through gaps in the bamboo walls he could see their silhouettes. Could have ended it then, but he needed them to run, needed them to spread the fear. He fired twice more, not at the men, but at the walls beside them. Splinters exploded inward. The Japanese dove for cover, returning fire wildly into the jungle at an enemy they could not see. In the chaos, Silas moved to the second building. One man had stayed there guarding supplies. Silas's bullet found him through the window. 5 down. When the firing finally stopped, Sato counted his remaining men. 3. Just 3 left from 6. We run, Sato said, his voice hollow. Scatter. Different directions. The ghost cannot follow all of us. They fled into the rain and darkness. Silas let 2 escape. But he followed the third, a young soldier who ran with panic in every step, crashing through the undergrowth with no attempt at stealth. The soldier never knew he was being hunted until the bullet arrived. 6 kills on the first day. By nightfall, the mythology was born. 2 survivors reached scattered Japanese positions with stories of an invisible warrior, a ghost who moved through rain like smoke, who killed from nowhere and vanished into the storm. The Americans called him Spectre. The Japanese began calling him something else. Ame no Yurei, the rain ghost. The second day brought heavier storms. A tropical depression had stalled over the Solomon Islands, dumping rain in quantities that seemed biblical. Rivers overflowed their banks, valleys turned into lakes. The jungle became a world of water. 8 of the scattered trainees had regrouped near a river crossing 7 miles to the east. They had chosen a defensible position on high ground with good sight lines and overlapping fields of fire. They posted sentries in shifts. They maintained discipline. They were determined not to fall prey to whatever had hunted their comrades. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed the ghost would avoid the water. Silas crossed the river a mile downstream, walking through chest-deep current in the pouring rain, his rifle held above his head. The water was cold. The current was strong. Any normal tactical doctrine would have called it madness. But Silas Hartwell was not thinking tactically. He was thinking like a hunter, and hunters know that prey watches the obvious approaches while ignoring the impossible ones. He emerged from the river downstream of the Japanese position, wringing water from his clothes, checking his rifle. Then he began his stalk. The assault came at dawn, not from the approaches they were watching, but from behind, from the river they thought protected them. The first sentry died without sound. The second tried to shout a warning, but managed only a strangled gasp before Silas's bullet found him. The other 6 woke to gunfire and chaos. They grabbed their weapons, took positions, scanned the jungle, saw nothing but rain and shadows. Silas had already moved, already relocated, already lined up his next shot. The third kill came from a different angle entirely, then the fourth, making it seem like there were multiple shooters, creating the illusion of a coordinated attack. The Japanese began firing wildly into the jungle, hundreds of rounds expended at targets that did not exist, at ghosts that moved between raindrops. When the firing finally stopped, 4 of the 8 were dead. The remaining 4 tried to hold their position. But fear had taken root. Every shadow held death. Every sound was the ghost moving closer. By mid-morning, Silas had killed 2 more. 6 dead. The remaining 2 broke and ran, abandoning their weapons, their training, their dignity. They fled in opposite directions, just running from something they could not fight or understand. Silas followed the first. The man crashed through the jungle with no attempt at stealth, his panic making him careless. After 300 yards, the soldier stopped to catch his breath, believing he had escaped. He leaned against a tree, gasping, his rifle forgotten at his side. Silas's bullet found him there. 7 down. The second runner had chosen a different path, heading east toward the coast. Silas tracked him for 20 minutes through the rain, following the obvious trail of broken vegetation and disturbed mud. When the man finally collapsed from exhaustion beside a stream too tired to run further, Silas ended it with a single shot. 8 kills, 8 men gone, 8 fewer threats to Marines, 14 total in 2 days. The third day was October 17th. The rain had not stopped, had not even slowed. It fell with mechanical persistence, as if the sky had forgotten how to do anything else. 7 more trainees had fortified a position on a ridge to the northeast. Lieutenant Sato was among them, having gathered other survivors who had escaped. They had learned from the fate of their comrades. They did not huddle together. They rotated positions constantly. They used expert camouflage discipline. Sato set a trap. 1 man positioned as bait, visible, moving carelessly, while the other 6 waited in concealment, rifles trained on likely sniper positions, ready to converge when the ghost revealed himself. It was a good plan, a professional plan. It might have worked against most snipers. But Silas Hartwell had been setting traps for prey since he was 9 years old, and he recognized bait when he saw it. He watched the obvious target through his scope for 20 minutes, saw the telltale signs of coordination, the glances towards certain positions, the way the man's movements were too casual to be real. Silas smiled. Then he moved away from the bait entirely and began hunting the hunters. He found the first hidden shooter by looking for where he himself would have positioned. A small rise with good sight lines, natural cover, easy escape route. The bullet took the Japanese soldier through the chest at 300 yards, through rain, through vegetation. A shot that should have been difficult, but felt automatic. The sound brought the other 6 converging on the position. Moving well, with discipline, exactly as they had been trained. But they converged on where Silas had been, not where he was. The firefight lasted 3 hours. A running battle through the rain-soaked jungle. Silas used the rain, used the terrain, used every trick learned in Indiana forests and Guadalcanal jungles. He fired and moved, never staying in position long enough to be triangulated. By afternoon, 7 had become 1. Lieutenant Sato crouched behind a fallen log. His uniform soaked his ammunition, nearly exhausted, his hands shaking. Around him lay 6 bodies, 6 men he had trained with, studied with, men who had believed Colonel Yamada's teachings would keep them alive.
All dead, all killed by something that should not exist. "Show yourself!" Sato screamed into the rain in Japanese. "Face me like a warrior!" The rain fell. The jungle was silent except for the drumming of water on leaves. Then a voice replied in broken Japanese, "I am no warrior. I am a farmer. You are not my enemy. You are simply in my way." Sato spun, fired at the voice. The bullets found nothing but trees and mud. When the echo faded, the voice came again from a different direction. "Go home, Lieutenant. Tell them about the rain ghost. Tell them what happens to those who hunt Americans."
"Then leave this island and never come back." Sato fired again and again, emptying his rifle at shadows, at ghosts, at fear itself. When his ammunition was exhausted, he waited for the bullet that would end him. It never came. After 10 minutes of silence, Sato stood slowly, looked at the bodies around him. Then he dropped his rifle and walked away, walked south, toward American lines, toward surrender, toward survival. Because Lieutenant Koji Sato understood finally that some enemies cannot be defeated, can only be survived. 21 total in 3 days. The fourth day, October 18th, brought strange quiet. The rain continued, but the intensity decreased. The storms were finally breaking, and the jungle, which had been full of fleeing Japanese trainees, now seemed empty. Intelligence reported the last group had taken shelter in an abandoned bunker near the coast. 3 men, the final holdouts. They had concrete and steel, good defensive position, but they also had fear. Silas approached the bunker at dusk, positioned himself 50 yards from the entrance, and he waited. At full dark, he called out in Japanese, "You are the last. Everyone else is dead or captured. You cannot win. You cannot escape. But you can live." Silence from the bunker. "Walk out now. Hands up. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will survive this war. Or stay inside and die when I collapse the entrance and bury you alive." 5 minutes of tense silence. Then conversation, argument, fear. Finally, 3 Japanese soldiers emerged, hands raised, weapons left behind, eyes searching the jungle for the ghost they had heard so much about. They saw nothing, just rain and shadows. "Walk south," the voice commanded from darkness. 100 yards. There is an American patrol waiting. Surrender to them. Tell them the rain ghost sent you." The 3 men walked, and as they walked, they swore they heard something behind them. Not footsteps, not breathing, just the sound of rain. The sound of a ghost who hunted in storms and left only legends behind. Silas watched them walk into Lieutenant Westmore's custody, watched the last of Colonel Yamada's students disappear into American lines. 24 total, 6 kills on day 1, 8 kills on day 2, 7 kills on day 3, 3 surrendered on day 4. Plus the 2 eliminated during the escape with Elliot. 26 of Colonel Yamada's program removed from the battlefield in 4 days. The official report would list 24, the number from the title, the number that would become legend. Intelligence would attribute the 2 escape kills to different operations, preserving the symmetry of the story. 24 snipers, 4 days, all disappeared. The mythology mattered more than the mathematics. October 19th, 1942. Silas returned to American lines exhausted, soaked, and silent. He filed his report with Colonel Morrison. Mission accomplished. Morrison read the report, then looked up with an expression that mixed awe and something close to fear. "The Japanese are calling you Ame no Yurei, the rain ghost. They've started pulling back from sectors where rain is forecast. Entire patrols refusing to operate in wet conditions." "Good," Silas replied simply. "Maybe fewer Marines die." The intelligence officer at the briefing added more. Colonel Yamada's program was designed for exponential expansion. Each of those 24 was supposed to train 24 more. Within a year, we could have faced thousands of highly trained enemy snipers across the Pacific. He paused, letting the weight sink in. "Conservative estimates suggest your 4 days of work saved between 300 and 500 American lives, possibly more." Silas said nothing. Numbers had never mattered to him, only results. Only bringing something home when Clara was hungry. Only doing what needed doing when there was no choice. 3 days later, he visited Elliot in the field hospital. His partner was sitting up in bed now, his shoulder bandaged but healing well. "You did it," Elliot said when Silas walked in. "I heard the reports. 24 disappeared, just like the stories." 24 is what they're calling it, Silas said, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "The exact number doesn't matter. What matters is they're gone." "The shot," Elliot said quietly. 847 yards. I've been running the calculations again and again. It should not have been possible. But it was. Why? How? Silas thought about his answer. About his father handing him a single bullet. About Clara's hungry eyes. About Uncle Owen teaching him that physics lived in bones. About 10 years of hunting in Indiana storms while other children stayed warm and dry. Because missing was never an option, he said finally. Not when I was 9. Not on that ridge. Not ever. Elliot nodded slowly. They're pulling us both from combat operations. Training duty. Major Whitman wants us to teach other snipers what you do. Over the next 2 years, Silas Hartwell and Elliot Bancroft developed what would become known as rain tactics doctrine, a systematic approach to operating in adverse weather that would be taught to thousands of Marines. Movement techniques, concealment methods, psychological strategies. The accumulated wisdom of a childhood hunting in Indiana storms compressed into training manuals that would save countless lives. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Silas's confirmed kill count for the Guadalcanal campaign stood at 93. 37 in the first 2 months of combat. 3 during the October 14th mission, including Colonel Yamada. 24 in the 4 days that followed, though officially recorded as 21 to preserve operational security. And 29 more over the following months before he was transferred to training duty. 93 confirmed kills. A number that would have been higher, but the Marine Corps needed him teaching more than fighting, needed his knowledge spread among hundreds of snipers rather than concentrated in one man. He never cared about the numbers, never kept count for himself. The only number that mattered was 24, the number of killers who would never kill Marines, the number of students whose master had died from an impossible shot, the number that had become mythology. November 1945. Silas Hartwell walked down the main street of Bloomington, Indiana, wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after 4 years in uniform. The hardware store stood on the corner. The church still held Sunday services. The farm where he had learned to hunt was still there, though smaller now. He walked up the dirt path to the farmhouse at dusk. The door opened before he reached it. His mother Ruth stood in the doorway, older, grayer, but with the same strength in her eyes. She said nothing, simply opened her arms. And Silas, who had killed 93 men and earned a Bronze Star with valor, walked into his mother's embrace and let himself be young again. Clara came running from the kitchen. She was 22 now, a woman rather than the hungry girl he remembered. But when she hugged him, he saw those same eyes, the ones that had looked up at him with trust when he was 9 and she was 6. "You came back," she whispered, "every single time." "I promised," Silas replied. Missing was never an option. He purchased the hardware store with his military savings. The owner was retiring, happy to sell to a local boy who had served. Silas wanted no fame, no recognition, just to build something useful, to serve his community in peacetime as he had served his country in war. The store prospered. He extended credit to farmers who needed it. He stocked equipment people actually wanted. He remembered every customer's name. He became part of the town's fabric, the quiet veteran who had done something important but never spoke of it. In 1948, he married Eleanor Hayes, a schoolteacher from Indianapolis. They had 3 children who grew up hearing nothing about their father's wartime exploits. Silas did not believe in glorifying what he had done. He had killed men because his country needed him to kill men. That was all. His father Nathan passed away in 1952, still working the fields until the very end. At the funeral, Silas remembered the man who had taught him the value of a single bullet without ever saying a word. Ruth followed 3 years later, dying peacefully in her sleep. Silas was grateful both parents had lived to see him come home, to see him build a life, to see that the hard lessons of their poverty had produced something worthwhile. Every year on October the 14th, the telephone would ring in the hardware store. Silas would answer to hear Elliot's Boston accent. "Remember the shot?" Elliot would ask. "Remember you got yourself shot?" Silas would reply, still complaining. "Someone has to keep the legend accurate." "No legend, just one bullet that went where it needed to go." The ritual continued for decades. 2 men from different worlds bound forever by a moment when the impossible became necessary. In 1987, a military historian tracked down Silas Hartwell. He was 67, still running his store, still quiet, still unassuming. "Mr. Hartwell," the historian said, spreading documents across the counter. "I've reviewed the records. The shot you made, 847 yards in those conditions. How did you do it?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, looking past the historian towards something only he could see. "When I was 9 years old," he said finally, "my father gave me a rifle and 1 bullet. He said, 'Bring back something or bring back the bullet. But you better bring back something. Your sister is hungry.'" He paused. "I learned that day what it means to not have a second chance. Every shot has to count because you might not get another one. On that ridge in Guadalcanal, Elliot was bleeding. 24 men were learning to kill my fellow Marines. I had one bullet that mattered.
The distance, the conditions, they didn't change what needed doing. I grew up hunting in Indiana rain while other boys stayed dry. By the time I reached Guadalcanal, I'd been training for that shot my whole life without knowing it. But the physics, the mathematics. Silas shook his head slowly. Elliot gave me the mathematics, the numbers. But numbers only get you close. The rest is knowing that failure isn't an option. When lives depend on it, you don't think about whether something's possible. You think about what happens if you don't try. He walked to the window, looking out at the ordinary street where ordinary people lived, ordinary lives, never knowing the quiet man who sold them nails had once done something extraordinary. The bullet went where it needed to go because it had to, because there was no other choice, because that's what happens when missing isn't an option.
Silas Hartwell passed away in 2003 at the age of 83, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. Clara, now 80 herself, sat beside his bed and held his hand as he slipped away. "You always came back with something," she whispered. "Every single time." Elliot Bancroft delivered the eulogy, speaking to a crowd that included Marines from 3 generations, all influenced by techniques developed from 1 impossible shot and 4 days of rain.
Silas always said there was no secret, Elliot told the mourners, his voice steady despite his years. He said he just pointed the rifle where the bullet needed to go and pulled the trigger. He made the extraordinary sound, ordinary. Elliot paused. But I was there. I was bleeding in the mud when he made that shot, and I can tell you there was nothing ordinary about it. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it regardless of whether it was possible. That's who Silas Hartwell was. Not a legend, just a man who refused to accept that something couldn't be done when lives depended on doing it. The flag that had draped Silas's coffin was folded with precision and presented to Eleanor, his wife of 55 years. In the crowd, a young Marine sniper who had studied Silas's techniques stood at attention, honoring a man he had never met, but whose legacy had shaped his entire career. And in the front row, Clara Hartwell wiped tears from her eyes, remembering a hungry little girl who had looked up at her brother with complete trust. He had never let her down. Not once. Not in 83 years. The lessons of that Indiana farm boy would continue to save American lives for generations. The techniques he developed hunting in the rain would become standard doctrine. The shot he made on October 14, 1942, would be studied in military academies worldwide. But the man himself would be remembered most for something simpler, for understanding that when your family is hungry, you bring home food. When your partner is bleeding, you take the shot. When 24 killers threaten your brothers, you hunt them through the rain until they disappear. 1 bullet. 1 chance. Make it count. That was the lesson of Silas Hartwell. That was the legacy of the Rain Ghost. That was why 24 Japanese snipers disappeared in Guadalcanal, and why hundreds of Marines who would have died to their bullets lived to go home instead. Because one farm boy from Indiana learned to hunt in the rain when everyone else ran for shelter. Because one Marine refused to believe that impossible was the same as unachievable. Because one man understood in his bones and in his soul that sometimes the worst conditions are the best advantages. And because in the end, missing was never an option.